Okay, we're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. So all rise and pledge allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Keller? Here. Commissioner Lennon? Here. Commissioner Bowden?
Here.
Chairman O'Brien?
Here. Okay, do we have any public comment for items not on tonight's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to adopt. We'll ask for a motion to adopt tonight's agenda. Motion, please.
A motion to adopt tonight's agenda.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, tonight's agenda has been adopted. Do we have any public comment on the consent agenda? Okay, seeing none. Do we have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I motion to approve the consent agenda.
I second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none. Consent agenda's approved. Okay. I'm sorry, you said that, Jen? Oh, okay, she'll catch up, that's fine. Okay, so next, we have no action items tonight, no official action items. The first is the business, it's number 4, General Plan Update 2020 Information and Schedule.
So I would do this for
Good evening, Commissioners. What we have for you tonight is a couple of informational items. The first, the general plan update schedule discussion will be conducted by Anders Hauge from Hauge Bruick and Associates. He's the town planning consultant. So I will turn it over to him.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Along with me is Christy Consolini. She works with us and on a number of projects here in the town. So you'll be seeing her as we go through this general plan process also. Regarding a general plan update, your plan was adopted in 2001, so you're coming up on 20 years. General plan guidelines recommend that you have a 20-year horizon in your general plan and that it should be updated to reflect that horizon. The California regulations also recommend that you update your general plan every 5 years. And also state law prohibits you from adopting or modifying your general plan more than 4 times a year, so generally once a quarter. And then also there's annual progress reporting, which goes on. I believe Mary Beth presented you the annual progress report recently, and that's done annually. And it's also a good time to just evaluate how your general plan is working and if changes should be made at that point in time. So it's all part of this process. Given your plan is 19 years old, we're moving forward with this process. The town council met on August 13th. We gave this general presentation. Some of it's changed. And one of the things that they suggested we do, directed we do, is move forward with this quickly. We were going to be spending time internally evaluating the plan. Council directed us move forward and start getting public input. So we are doing that tonight's the kickoff for that process. So why do you need to update? There are changes that have been occurring. One, state of California now requires a greenhouse gas element in the general plan. It also requires a social justice element of the general plan, which you don't have. Recent regulations regarding traffic and transportation requires that the town uses vehicle miles traveled as their standard for evaluating impacts. That needs to be incorporated into the general plan. Also, the town has recently received draft RHNA numbers, the regional housing needs. Those numbers have gone up for the town, so it's important to look at how the town can accommodate that on the land use diagram with appropriate general plan land use designations to meet those requirements. Also, the community setting over the last 18, 19 years has changed, and it's time to reflect building lots that are no longer available and sites that have developed and reflect that in the setting section of your general plan. And one of those really important things, again, is the housing site availability to meet your RENA goals. We're looking at, there's direction change in the community, and you recently had a referendum that gave you some direction. So definitely those properties known as the villages need to be looked at in the general plan update to make sure that the town is following the direction that the community wants to go. Also, there have been a number of lessons learned in reviewing projects. Mary Beth has a number of examples in the short time she's been here of where there's inconsistencies in the general plan, the zoning code, and those need to be cleaned up. Because your general plan is your constitution, and the codes, ordinances, standards, and guidelines are required to be consistent with the general plan, and right now they're not. Some of the changes are changes in technology. Definitely self-driving cars may change traffic and circulation patterns in the future. The iPhones, a simple thing like you can now order up on Amazon or many of these things, and traffic changing with the trucks coming to your houses now where they didn't before, so some of those changes need to be reflected. The economy has shifted over these number of years. E-commerce is now a major change in the economy, and that changes how your downtown and your commercial areas work. So those are some of the changes that have occurred, and they just need to be reflected in the general plan update. As I said before, your general plan is the Constitution. It is what you look at, and everything flows from the general plan, so that includes any master plans, area plans, specific plans. Also your municipal code, which includes the zoning ordinance, and also any guidelines and standards such as your tree ordinance and those guidelines all have to be consistent with the general plan. So the suggested process we're going to be following is we begin with a consistency evaluation process, and we're adding to that a public outreach component to gather information from the community on things that they feel need to be addressed in the general plan and in the codes and ordinances. And one of the things that is handed out tonight is a green form, which says step 1 in the process, consistency evaluation and information gathering. So this is going to be available. If people fill it out, you fold it over, mail it back to the town. Also, there's a new email address on there, so if somebody wants to email comments and recommendations to the town, it can be done on the email. During this step in the process, there's not going to be a lot of public feedback on what we're learning. We're going to be gathering information. The staff will be doing the consistency evaluation with your codes, ordinances, and general plan. And the next step then is taking that information we gather in this process, and we will be releasing that information to say, this is what we've learned. And at that time, we go into a town, agency, and community process where we're further gathering input. So when you can see, in the land use element, these are the changes that are recommended. The land use diagram, these are the changes that have been suggested. Some of those may be in conflict, but it's a time for the community to come together and basically have public workshops, public outreach to try and resolve those issues and get a direction. In this process, the council will take a lead in the process. In my years of experience, what I found, if the council is not taking a lead, the process can divert, and that becomes a disaster when you come to the council with a general plan recommendation and they say, no, that's not what we wanted. So in the process, we'll be involving the council to make sure that any conflicts are resolved by the council before we move forward. Now, during this time also of the evaluation and the community input, technical studies may be required, and as we identify those would be commenced. So one thing at this time, Mary Beth and I have been meeting with the county, who was updating their housing element at this moment in time, and it looks like the town can tier off of that document, create a town document, but use a consultant the county's using so that we have a consistency within Placer County and town of Loomis for the housing element. The other thing that Mary Beth and I just found out is the county's also getting ready to update their traffic analysis to actually include VMT analysis. And they're using the firm of Fair and Peers, who actually worked with the State Office of Planning and Research in developing VMT standards. And so we're going to see if we can work between the town staff, which is Wood Rogers, and the county, and so we can have, again, something that we're tiering, not reinventing the wheel, and using that information for updating the traffic analysis. As I understand, what's that? VMT, vehicles, miles traveled. Yeah.
That's a new concept for us.
That is a new concept in the state.
We'll explain briefly what that means.
Okay. So basically, the concept of vehicle miles traveled is a concept of tracking how many miles somebody drives and reducing that to reduce greenhouse gases. So, for instance, and I don't have the numbers for Loomis, but generally in the foothills, you'll find that there's approximately 2.5 to 3 persons per household. And per person, you drive about 7.5 miles a day in various trips to the post office, to the school, to the grocery store. So you multiply the number of persons times the number of miles. And then part of that also is what kind of trips are they taking? Are you driving to Roseville, or are you just driving in Loomis? And you evaluate those. And the whole intent is to have a standard that is reduced. Those vehicle miles are reduced. I think one of the more interesting things the state is looking at is not using level of service, which you're used to using, primarily because level of service is looking about how to make the traffic smooth. In some ways, if you don't worry about level of service, the traffic congests and people will stay home. So in a way, it's a strategy of let the congestion happen, because then people will stay home, as a strategy to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. So this is brand new. The state doesn't have guidelines yet. It looks like the county will be, so hopefully we can tier with them in doing that. Once we get done with the process of the community input, and that would be a lot of public workshops to get that information, and we get direction from the council, then we'll proceed with actually writing the draft plan and ordinance updates. And once that's done, there'll also be a draft EIR produced at the same time, and then that will again go out for public circulation and evaluation. Once the draft document has circulated, then it goes into the final document. Final document will be reviewed by the Planning Commission and Council, and hopefully then a decision will be made. We're looking that the consistency evaluation and information gathering will occur this fall and winter, that the community and agency input will begin this fall, because we started the input, but it will be completed hopefully in the early spring. Part of that strategy is the holidays are not a great time to do public hearings and workshops, and that we would look at then the spring and fall, or summertime. Through the summer of early spring through the summer, we'll do the community agency input, and then spring and fall we'll have the draft updates and environmental document, and then hopefully you can be looking at approval in the year 2021. So it's about a 2-year process. Now, that all depends on how things change, the kinds of comments, the kind of technical studies are required. So that's a fairly optimal schedule to get the general plan update done, but we will be monitoring as we go along and adjusting the schedule as appropriate, and providing you with updates on that as we go through the process. So one of the things we did give you is a Gantt chart, which is, I think I heard somebody say, a project management tool that we use that shows the various steps to get you to the general plan. One of the things I just wanted to note, when you look at the number of days, those are in work days, and it excludes holidays. So this chart looks at 5 working days a week, 22 working days a month, and the holidays are excluded. So you'll see some extended. It doesn't look like too many days, but in the holiday period, it pushes it out. So it is a management tool, and we will keep that updated. So if there's any delays, we can quickly show you where you are in the process and what the delays have caused. So that's the schedule, which we gave you at 11 by 17, which is a little bit easier to read than on the screen. So that's a brief overview of the process. We have some additional presentations that we'll be giving to the Planning Commission over the next couple of months. And honestly, Mary Beth, I forgot what those were, but we scheduled out a couple presentations.
One presentation up and coming that I wanted to bring to your attention was the October 8th council meeting. 6 o'clock, we're going to do a joint commission council meeting, and we'll have representatives here from SACOG and HCD to discuss RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation. Those numbers are just getting finalized, so it's a good time to get them on board. So I just got that confirmation today.
What was that date again, Mary Beth?
October 8th.
Was it at 7?
1800.
6.
Yeah.
It's Tuesday. It's the regular council meeting night. Yeah, so 6 to 7, we'll give them an hour.
And I believe also in October, we're looking at what we're calling General Plan 101, just the basics of the general plan and what's required. A couple things I failed to mention. One, your general plan has been working really well for you. There's just a couple of things that I think probably need some tweaking and looking at. And we're looking at focusing on the land use element, and then from the land use element, if things need to change, we'll look at the other elements and make sure they're consistent. But our focus is primarily going beyond the land use element as we go through the process. And so what we're asking now, especially you as a planning commission, you've probably sat there and had questions of why are we doing this? Why do we have to approve this? You know, I wish. Your input is going to be extremely helpful in identifying from your lessons learned what works and what you would like to see modified in your general plan and the codes of ordinances that support it. So that's very important. I think on land use, a lot of the land uses work, but we know that the villages needs to be looked at. We know that Turtle Island probably needs to be looked at. There's some questions about that area. So there's a couple of areas in town that probably say, is this the right path we're on? Is this working for us? And take it from there. So I believe that pretty much covers what we wanted to present to you tonight.
The only thing I'll add is the benefit of tearing off those county documents is it saves us a lot of money. So, you know, whenever we can let them, I mean, we still have a cost, but it's going to be much reduced, and I think that's a big benefit.
Well, I think with the housing element, Mary Beth and I worked on the Sutter Creek general plan, and we jointly did our housing element with Amador County. And the county has opportunities for homeless shelters and other housing needs that the town of Loomis really doesn't have within the city limits or town limits. And so it becomes an opportunity to identify what those regional resources are and appropriately identify those as part of the Loomis housing element. I don't think there is, the state law does suggest that there be locations for homeless shelters if necessary. I don't think, yes, it actually does require land use and zoning for those. So it's one of the things that the state does require.
So other than cost, what are the advantages to us working with a large entity like the county with a lot of different kinds of needs than a small town? Rather than, for instance,
Right.
having visualized come back who's done it twice.
One advantage is the analysis that needs to go into a housing element regarding where the resources are, how large the parcels have to be. One of the things that will occur is when it comes to goals and objectives, there will be specific goals and objectives and implementation measures identified for the town of Loomis that may not be the same as the county, and that's what's going to come to you directly to make it your document. But it really comes into the analysis that needs to go into the setting, the existing conditions, the analysis of how to achieve the housing needs. Also, some of the strategies that they're developing, I think might be considered by the town of Loomis. And just so you know, I sit on the Placer County Planning Commission, and I've been working with Shauna Purvis in the housing element update, coming up with some ideas that hopefully are creative and doable for providing housing. So I think they may come up with a whole different set of goals and policies and implementation measures than you need, but the way this would work is the consultant writing that document would in fact tailor goals, policies, and objectives and implementation measures that are specific to Loomis.
Tailor it down to our small housing.
That is correct. That is correct.
Would they be starting from scratch, or would they look at what we already have? For instance, when we did the last round on the housing element, we looked at parcels all over, and we were looking at the requirements like a certain acreage, agreeable owners, not having a whole multiple set of owners, access to transportation, shopping, that kind of thing. Are they going to start from scratch, or is anybody going to say, hey, a lot of this has already been looked at, let's just review it? I just wondered.
They will be starting from the existing available information. They will be relying heavily on the geographic information systems, GIS systems. It's one of the things that we're actually working with Mary Beth and Carol on now to update the town of Loomis GIS system to reflect what's actually on the ground today, both existing uses and vacant land. So that information will go into their analysis. So they're definitely going to be using what's available. They're not going to reinvent the wheel.
On your vehicle miles traveled, do you look at other types of transportation, like how many people are using public transportation?
That will be one.
Cycling,
Bill.
pedestrian traffic, things like that.
Walking, hiking, bicycling will all be looked into, and the vehicle miles traveled standard, I believe, deals with the cars. Okay. It's a car standard. Okay. So if you can divert persons out of the car into hiking or to bicycles or to transit, then that will be a positive in reducing the vehicle miles traveled.
Does the business travel, for instance, deliveries to Swetzer, light industrial or other businesses, do those factor in, or is it mainly residents traveling their vehicle miles?
At this moment in time, I have not seen the standards, so we're going to have to see what the state comes up with. Okay. But it is appropriate given there is more in commercial traffic, basically UPS trucks, Amazon trucks, FedEx trucks driving around. I know in larger cities are now designating spots for these vehicles to park to deliver their goods and then get out of there as quickly as possible. I don't think Loomis is of the side that we need to do that, but those are some of the strategies that are coming up in larger communities that we have not seen in the past. Especially, and where it comes in large communities, people who are working don't want to leave their packages at home, so they're creating boxes in buildings, and I think I saw some over here at Home Depot where they're Amazon boxes, and you can drive it and pick up your package right there at the Home Depot. So they're doing similar things, for the packages for people who are working or who are concerned about their packages being stolen. And I just got a notice that Ford now will allow you to unlock your car to put a package in the car if it's sitting at home. So, the technology is shifting here fairly rapidly, and I think it will shift how we plan our communities. So it's new, it's different, don't have all the answers, but I'm looking forward to seeing what some of these are.
And here, if you use a street address rather than a P.O. box, you can have your FedEx and UPS delivered to the post office.
Oh, you can? Good.
Not every post office does that, but...
True. But those are some of the things that, have shifted in how we do business, so.
I was a little unclear. You said the Planning Commission is going to work on some of these things, but I didn't exactly see when you went over the list of things how that fit in.
Well, let's go through. We're going to be in this fall-winter timeframe, the evaluation and gathering of information, we're going to be coming to the commission with some educational pieces. Like I said, one is going to be on the general plan. I think probably one is going to be on Sequin. We'll work with Andreas on that to understand how that fits with the whole process. Administrative record may be something, I don't know if you've gone through that with them, but a little bit of information of how that works for this process. And then if there's questions or information that comes up, one of the things we've been doing, the town has been doing, is inventorying potential lands for trees to be planted. And turns out there's not that many places that are owned by the town that you can plant trees. So we're expanding the study to take a look at potential sites that may be under private ownership, that maybe there's some opportunities to work easements out, whatever, in order that we have enough land to plant trees. So once we get that, that's one of the reports that I think we'll come forward with. We'll come to the Planning Commission with information as it's updated to keep you informed. And we'll continue to ask you, especially in this phase, what are your experiences and what would you like to see addressed in this update? And I think as you review projects before the Planning Commission, you're going to have to think, geez, this could have been a little bit better had we thought about it. So I think this time is allowing that. So we're gathering information now. During the community and agency input, the intent is, I believe, to do workshops both with the council and the Planning Commission in order to get input with the community, with agencies. Council has told us that they would like to see some committees formed. We need to talk about that. My experience with committees has not always been the best. I think the worst was we did the Nevada County General Plan. It was a committee of 500 people. We went through 2 years of studies, went to the Board of Supervisors, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. So, one, the council's member, at least a council member is going to be involved, preferably committees of 5 or fewer or no more than 10 work in getting something done. Committees that focus on an issue instead of broad issues are strategies that I found to work really well in working with committees. And then the workshops where you get down with the public and you can sit down and actually work out issues. So in some of those cases, we'll make sure that we work with the Brown Act, but we would invite both the council and the Planning Commission to some workshops, but we just make sure that no more than 2 of you together at any one time in order to avoid that conflict. But we've also found those workshops have been very successful in getting to know what people want. One of the things we'll do as staff is sit down and say, if somebody from the public is there, say, what's your issue? Let's help you write your comment up that makes sense to us as planners, that works for us, rather than just an emotional response. Let's talk about what you really want, what are some of the consequences, what are some of the options, and we'll work with individuals and the commission in writing those up so that we have good, solid input into the document.
So Joe Brown said, writes up the green thing or comes to the meeting and says, I want to change my 4.6 acre zoning to 2.3 to 1 acre or 10 to the acre, whatever.
Right.
Then what happens?
What happens, we'll gather all that information and put it into a document that'll come out to you and the council and to the public. And then when we go into the community and agency input phase where we're workshops, then we begin talking with the council, Planning Commission about how do we resolve these issues. Is this something that you think is worthwhile to pursue, and start getting your input in which direction we take with that. Because my guess is we're going to get input that are, at opposites. And
a lot of people won't want to do that.
That's right. So what we're going to have to do is, confer with you and then eventually with the council of which direction you want to take on this. What's the direction that the town wants to take in moving forward? And so that process called community agency input is that engagement process where we begin to whittle down that list and say, this is where we need to go. And part of that list also, if we find that there are parts of the general plan, the land use diagram that everybody's happy with, we're going to note that saying, everybody's happy with this. Just leave it alone. Don't touch it. You know, it works just the way it is. And then really focus on those things where there are some issues.
So ultimately, are the committees going to, for instance, look at issues around something and make a recommendation, or is the council going to basically gather everything themselves and they will make all the recommendations? They will decide.
Okay, we have not decided what committees, how they would work at this moment in time. The intent would be if there are committees that their reports would come to the commission would evaluate it, make a recommendation, it goes to the council. With a council member on the committee, you know, I think that helps in making sure the council is informed of where the process is going. But again, you are the advisory body to the council. You need to look at this information and make your recommendations.
Other commissioners have any questions?
I think when it comes to just the education and information, I think I definitely would like to know more about the legislation, like what do we legally have to follow, you know, what are the laws that we need to be incorporating in the land use, especially for housing.
Yeah.
So, you know, today I was at the county for the Board of Supervisor meeting, and they essentially were going through their work plan and trying to identify policy, you know, and
Right.
you know, such as inclusionary zoning and the fees in lieu, and I don't even know what we have in place here in Loomis, you know, to try to, you know, I guess begin to mitigate should we need to actually produce any kind of affordable housing.
Your zoning code and general plan currently provide for designations that allow affordable housing. We may need more because your requirement is going up. But that information will, as we gather that information, we will let you know. But we will also, as we look at the documents, it could be that one of the things we do in this process during the collection phase is go through each of the elements and just say, this is what this element means, this is what it does, this is how it works together. And that may be a good educational thing to do, just to refresh you on what the elements are and how they work. And I'm sure you'll have recommendations to us as we go through the elements saying, we really didn't want to do that, or we would like to do that. I mean, one of the inconsistencies right now that we're dealing with is your general plan sets coverages, and then your zoning ordinance sets different coverages, and they're not consistent. Zoning ordinance can sometimes modify it, but it really becomes difficult when an applicant comes in and says, I want a certain coverage. The general plan trumps the zoning code. And right now, there's some confusion, so we need to get that cleaned up. I think there's some, trying to think some of the other issues on definitions. You know, there's a couple of definitions that Mary Beth and I have tried to struggle. What does it really mean, and how do we apply that on a project? So we'll be working with that. One of the things I'm going to, again, recommend is we do a single glossary for the town that has every single definition in one place. And then the other documents will reference that and summarize some of those definitions, say in the zoning code, whatever, for easy reference. But the reason is, if you have a definition in the general plan and then one in the zoning code and one in the transportation element, and they don't line up, it is a real problem. So by having one glossary for the town of Loomis that has all the definitions in there, then we can clean that up and get a consistent set of glossary and then just reference it in other documents. The other thing I think we're going to be recommending to you is probably putting your general plan in 4 volumes. Volume 1 would be policy document, and that's a document that you can only modify 4 times a year. The second volume would be a collection of all your standards, master plans, area plans. And the reason for that is so that an applicant comes in, they know of you've adopted. And sometimes there are master plans and area plans that people forget are out there. So by putting it into one place, you have a single place where people can go reference. The third volume is the setting, so that the town setting is in one place. And where this is getting to, one of the pet peeves I have is CEQA documents reinvent the wheel every single time. and don't build on the existing setting section to describe what the community is. And so the recommendation is you have one setting section, and as environmental documents come in, they tier off that, update it as appropriate, so you have a consistent, solid setting section, and you're not going back and rewriting the geology or some of the other topics that haven't changed in a long, long time. So you have, say, a biology section in your setting section. What you would do is just go under a project review and look at, for that site, are there any new species that have been found on the site? And you update the setting section to say these are the species found on the site. And then the fourth volume would be a place for your environmental documents. And again, the whole intent there is to tier off your general plan environmental document with all your other approvals so that you're consistent, you're not reinventing the wheel, and basically streamline the process. It is so frustrating to see an environmental the complete thing rewritten over and over and over. And to me, it's a waste of money. And it's not consistent and doesn't provide the town with the kind of information that you need. So we'll be further talking to you and the Planning Commission about that, and the Town Council about that, but it's a strategy that's worked for me a number of times, and it provides for the long-term maintenance of your general plan.
These are aside from the elements, or the elements were incorporated into these somehow?
The elements, basically you have for each element a setting section, and so that would be part of the setting. And then for each element you have goals, policies, objectives, and implementation measures, and they're in your policy document. So the other thing about that is you can update Volume 2, the area plans anytime you want. You can update the settings section anytime you want, and you can update your environmental section anytime you want. So it's only the policies that would be limited to your 4 updates a year.
Does staff have any additional comments or? Okay.
No, I'm looking forward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so. It's exciting.
yeah,
For sure.
deep dive.
Andre, do we open this to public comment, this discussion? Is this part
It's just an information item, and I think you had already asked for public comment on this.
that was for items not on the agenda.
Oh.
Okay.
You can.
All right, well, I'll reserve a moment for that. So, okay.
Is there public comment?
Yep, public comment.
Do I need to give my name? David Ring, 3486 Del Mar. Just 3 comments, a couple questions. For the bit where you're talking about the technology, you haven't mentioned this, but and you can't include everything, but drones possibly. You might want to incorporate that just to be safe. The other question I had, like drones, like delivery drones, they're coming. Yeah, and so we need to just, do we want it, do we not? I don't know, it's just something we have to talk about. Oh. And the meeting you were talking about at 6 o'clock on the 8th, is that a public meeting, or is that, okay, and that's outside the normal time of the planning, or the
town council
the,
meeting.
okay,
So it'll be a workshop with the council and the planning commission.
okay. Is that all going to be, and then you said there's other meetings that were going to be informational meetings as well. Do those all go on the town calendar?
Yes, so, those will be held on regular planning commission nights.
Okay.
And part of the agenda.
Okay, and then one final question, which is a little specific, and I don't know if anybody knows, somebody knows the answer, I just don't know who it is. With the regional housing needs document that comes out, those new numbers, does the areas of town that we've already allotted for that, do we need to allot, if the numbers were to stay the same, would we be able to keep those, would we have to allot any more beyond that? So like we had to allot a certain number of houses for the past allotment. Do we need more than, if the numbers were to stay the same, would we have to do twice the amount, or does it?
The numbers are going to increase.
Right.
So yes, we'll have to designate.
But do we need to designate just the change, or do we need to designate a whole, like if it was 2, say the first time, and we designated 2, and now it goes to 3, do we need 3 additional more, or do we just need to do 1 more?
1 more.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Anybody else?
One more thing I forgot, I should have written it down real quickly. Because we're beginning this process of gathering information, Mary Beth would be the person to coordinate, but we're able to go out and talk to groups that may want to kind of find out where the process is, a presentation possibly similar tonight. And as we gather more information, there's probably more information. So it's one of the outreaches is to go out and meet with groups in the community who may have an interest in the general plan update. And if they, probably provide some of the education about how the process works and what the expectations are.
I have another question now.
Uh-oh.
So when you're gathering all of this information so that hopefully it's going to be completed like around, I guess, the fall of 2021 or somewhere around there.
Actually, the information gathering should be completed, we're hoping, in February of 2020.
Okay.
And then we'll go into the outreach and begin to try and whittle down what we carry forward or not during the spring and summer of 2020.
Okay. Because my question was actually, does it tie in at all with the census that's coming up in 2020 and all that information that's collected with demographics and,
The census information, as I recall, takes a few years to come out. So we'll be using California Department of Finance information, which is also what the state uses for the RENA numbers. And at such time as the census information comes out, hopefully you'll have the setting sections and you update that when that information is available. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think we're done with that section.
I had a comment on when you look at all the available land that's around, one of the things is, as we found before, we have a lot of large parcels, and you think, oh, look, it could go there, there, and there, and there. Except a lot of that is out in the country, and there's no infrastructure, there's no sewer, all those kinds of things. There's no public transportation, so things that look at first glance are not necessarily going to work here.
A lot of wetlands, too.
Yeah.
And access to some of those parcels. I think it's really important to educate the public. They don't know what is required of us and what is required up there. They just want no growth, a lot of them. And so you look at them and go, well, that's not what we can do, and they emotionally get upset about it. And so the more we can educate the town people, not just a handful that are very vocal, there's a lot of people that aren't very vocal, but they just don't get involved. And I hope there's some way to gather more people in and get the word out and how important it is for their input of what they'd like to see, knowing what the parameters are. So.
I think there could be a lot of informational sessions.
Yes, but to get them here,
That's
And the other thing to that is, now that our meetings are recorded, they're archived.
That's true.
So,
They can go online.
if somebody says, oh, I want to know about, it's like, well, go watch this video. And that's why we're starting the educational stuff early, to help us build going forward.
Now, will all the workshops also be videoed?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
depending on where they're at.
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay.
And as long as we can do them on the Tuesday night kind of thing with council or planning.
Mostly, yeah.
The important ones. The workshops, even if we just sit a video recorder in the corner, just to kind of get a flair for what's going on.
And then if I can give a plug for the town talk, so we will be launching that back up at the library next Tuesday. It's the first Tuesday each month. And essentially, Sarah and Deborah, the program director, are going to be working with Mary Beth so that they can piggyback off of all of the topics that Mary Beth is kind of launching. I'm one of those folks who I need a little bit of processing time, and so when the information is given to me, I kind of have to mull it over. And so then hopefully, we can marinate and come to town talks and then actually have this dialogue where it's not just public comment. You can actually have this back and forth exchange of information. So that'll just kind of reinforce the ideas and principles and information.
Exactly. And then also on our website, any of the literature and stuff you have in front of you, the green comment cards, all of that stuff will be there too. And we'll run that kind of chronologically, so to speak, so it's easy to find, easily attainable. From the website, you can, contact us at gpupdate.loomis.ca.gov. You can actually click on that link and send us directly an email. So we'll get everything around in one place.
And that's at the library itself.
It's 2 to 6, 6 to 7:30.
I thought Town Talks was now put in the daytime.
No, 6 to 7:30. First Tuesday each month.
At the library.
And so next week, the guest speakers will be Sean and Mary Beth. And essentially they'll go through the general plan, what is it, a lot of definitions.
Okay, so I think we'll,
I have a comment. One of my goals, because the planning commission often gets stuck between the general plan and the zoning ordinance and the inconsistencies that exist between those two documents. So I really kind of look to staff to do some kind of analysis and eliminate those inconsistencies, because I honestly feel that the town is exposed to some potential litigation when you zone property a certain way, but then you go to the zoning ordinance and you could never achieve a buildable parcel when you have certain size setbacks, minimum frontages, and other minimum lot size requirements. It's not possible to achieve the zoning that's been designated in many areas. And that's just one example of inconsistencies that we often face. And I would like to see that stuff eliminated so we have a firm and logical guide to follow. Because a lot of things end up being taken on issue by issue, one at a time, case by case.
well, I think that's part of this whole process. I think I'll be in that too. I'm with you.
And those things will come forward to you in more of a matrix, where it's like general plan for residential. What does it say? And now, okay, the next column over is going to be what does zoning say? So those things will just pop off the page right away, so that we know where those issues lie.
That we identify.
And then how do we go forward from there is what we'll be looking for in our recommendation.
And we used to make it clear, and I don't know if it's still written someplace, that just because it says it's a certain number of units per acre, that doesn't mean that you're going to get that by the time you take out your infrastructure, and you may have wetlands, and major wetlands, we're not going to let you count all the wetlands for all the lots. It's those things. I don't know if people always understand that. Something that I don't know that it needs to be part of the general plan work, although it will be part of it as far as the housing. Yes, we'll be working with the RENA and some of the laws, but I think it would be helpful to the Planning Commission if we had a session sometime that we could just plain go over the new housing regulations that came in last year in January or something, and there were 16 or so major laws, some of which may or may not impact us much, but I would like to know what our responsibility is for those things, and so that we are aware of them and watching out for them, and when people ask us questions, we can answer them intelligently, or otherwise we have to keep referring them to you. But sometimes if you know the answer, you can just explain.
So as one of the workshops during this whole general plan process, I think what we're hearing here tonight is that we'll have one dedicated to going over our obligations to provide housing, meet the housing numbers, and we'll just make that one of the workshop topics to address those concerns.
Thank you.
Grace, you may want to mention that you and Jeff are also monitoring. There's potential laws right now, and these guys are monitoring what those are. So
Yeah, so for housing legislation alone, I have a tracker on the state's legislation website where every night at midnight or thereabout, I get an email that gives me all of the action that's happened on all of the housing legislation that's currently pending. So we're keeping up to date on that.
Okay.
Well, keep us up to date, at least after it passes, or if it looks like it's going to be passing and it's significant.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the Brown Act.
All right, good evening, everyone, and right off the bat, how do I get out of this presentation for just a second?
Just escape.
Escape. Had it moved onto our fancy new template, and somebody left an extra, how do I cut that out since we're on the spot editing to make it factually accurate? All right. Sorry about that. Don't want to give anybody the wrong impression that we're trying to hide this information. I'm not really sure what happened there and that that's still stuck there. But anyways, moving along. So the reason we're doing this presentation tonight on the Brown Act, just a refresher, is we had a fairly light agenda, and staff and I, we thought it's a good idea to periodically do this, even outside of the obligation to every 2 years do the AB 1234 training. It's just a good idea to keep fresh on this stuff. So let's begin with the purposes of the Brown Act. The Brown Act is one of California's pieces of sunshine legislation to give the public an open view of what the government is doing. It's one of California's big policies is to have a very transparent way that the government is conducting its business. So the way we break these down is that there's the first goal, purpose is the access, to ensure that the decision-making process of legislative bodies happens in public so that everybody's aware. There are some exceptions to that, and those are always very limited, and that's the closed sessions, and the state prescribes very narrow grounds where closed sessions are appropriate. And that's really to protect some other public policy interest that's at play that is kind of at odds with the public policy interest in having public meetings. And we'll get more into closed sessions a little later. The other is where there's a lack of quorum, there is no meeting, so there's no need to have that meeting in public if you're not going to have an actual meeting where decisions get to be made. The second purpose is to provide notice. And even if you have a public meeting, if nobody knows about it, then that's not much good because the public actually has to know that it's happening for them to be able to show up. And then the third purpose of the Brown Act is to encourage participation of the public. It's to make sure that the public can exercise its guaranteed right under California law to participate in the decision making by providing comment to the legislative body as decisions are being made. Now, with public comment, it's important to note that it is public comment, it's not a public discussion, and so while it's sometimes tempting to get into a back and forth exchange, there are no obligations under the Brown Act to directly engage with every public comment and to make sure that every question that gets raised is answered immediately. That's not to say it's not appropriate to direct staff to look into issues and to answer questions where appropriate. So the first question is, what is a legislative body that is subject to the Brown Act? Here in Loomis, it's the town council, and under that is also any committee that is created by formal action of the town council. One of those committees for our purposes here in the town of Loomis is the Planning Commission, is such a committee that is appointed by the council. There are a number of what often look and feel like Brown Act bodies that aren't actually, and the first of those is what's sometimes called ad hoc committees, and those are advisory committees that are made up of less than a quorum of the members of a legislative body. So if we had an advisory committee that was made up of 1 or 2 of you and some members of the community, for instance, that wouldn't be a Brown Act body unless it's a committee that is given some sort of indefinite jurisdiction over a particular topic, and has set meeting dates. Ad hoc committees, by definition, have to not have regular meeting dates. They have to be ad hoc, as the term kind of is known to mean. And they can't have a continuing jurisdiction. So a good example of that is when there's a committee appointed to look into hiring a new general manager. That tends to be done by this kind of committee, and those meetings aren't subject to the Brown Act. Another type of committee that is not subject to the Brown Act is committees that are appointed only by the mayor in the case of a town, or the chair in the case of a special district, or the head of a board of directors, for instance. So the advisory committees that we were discussing earlier that might be formed when it comes to doing the general plan update, we don't know yet whether or not those would be Brown Act bodies, depending on how they're constituted. And it's really too early to tell now, but nevertheless, there could be an occasion where we have a workshop that involves both the town council and the planning commission. And if we'd like to have all of you there, then that would definitely qualify as a Brown Act meeting. So any of those workshops would be subject to all of the notice requirements and all of the whole shebang of everything that goes into having a Brown Act meeting. So next, getting into what is a Brown Act meeting. It is any congregation of a majority of the members of a legislative body at the same time or place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of that legislative body. So here I think the key is that it is really anything that could be before that legislative body. It's not just any topic that is currently an issue, anything that is currently on an agenda, anything that's on the near horizon. It's really anything that's within the subject matter of that body. Anything that could conceivably give rise to a decision down the line. So that's perhaps a little broader than some people sometimes think it is. But it's important to keep that in mind when you're on a legislative body that's subject to the Brown Act, when you're... I see a question.
Does that include decisions that have already been made?
Past decisions, insofar as that they could come back for a reevaluation or for further discussion related to them, yes. If it's something that is done and put to bed, then that's a little different. The other thing to keep in mind is that here, discuss and deliberate is fairly liberally construed, so fairly broad. So even though you may think of deliberations as when you're having comments back and forth after an applicant has given a presentation and staff has given the report, deliberation under the Brown Act isn't that formal of a process. It's any time you're discussing, you're pontificating, you're thinking about what would I do in this situation. That counts as deliberation. So if you're doing that with two others on the commission and doing that out loud so that they hear what you're thinking, that's potentially deliberation. So what is not a Brown Act meeting is also something important to know, because it's a small community here in Loomis and you're bound to bump into each other. So individual contacts between any of you a quorum wouldn't be reached, so that would be okay. That's not a Brown Act meeting. Anytime you're out in public, you don't have to be worried about violating the Brown Act just because you might bump into another one of you on the commission. And then there's also limited circumstances where a quorum, where 3 or more of you could be attending something at the same time without having first have to go through the whole notice procedure. And the main one where it comes up is conferences. If 3 or more of you want to go to some trade conference, there's often a concern among commissioners, council members, board members. Hey, all of us want to go to this great aqua conference that's happening down here. There's something that's really important being discussed there, but won't we have a meeting? No. The Brown Act specifically considers that a viable, or not a viable, an important public policy to have members of these legislative bodies be informed. So that's why participation at conferences by more than a quorum is okay. Another thing is if you're attending meetings of another legislative body, and as long as there is a topic of interest being discussed. So here, along with the bottom bullet here, committee meetings where non-committee members attend, the key is to not be participating actively in the discussion. It's okay for you to observe. If you as a legislative body are attending a town council meeting, for instance, but you're actively participating, then it would really have to have been noticed as a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Town Council. This exemption here is really more designed if you're observing, if more than a quorum of you are observing and not
So
participating.
that's like public comment, if we just stand up, it's not a good idea to participate in public comment. at
It is
council.
not, no, because that would be participating in the deliberations and the decision-making.
Now, is that only if there are more than one other person of the planning commission that would be?
If you have a quorum there. So if there's 2 of you, that's different. But if there's 3 of you there, that's where it starts to get dicey about making public comments if it's not been agenda as a joint meeting.
But what about if it's televised? Because then, who knows who's watching? You know, I mean, if it.
Well, watching is different. Watching is not deliberating. So,
No, I mean, if, let's say I were to make a public comment.
Okay.
And there was only one other planning commissioner at a town council meeting.
mhm.
But then it's televised, and then the other planning commissioners could or may not watch. Have I violated by making?
So you didn't get the presentation ahead of time, but you've had it on your table there in front of you. You might have flipped ahead to serial meetings, so we'll be getting to that. The other kind of thing that comes up sometimes is social or ceremonial events, and that would be like the state of the town address. That kind of event where it's really more of a ceremonial getting together than any decisions actively being made, any actions being taken. Were there any further questions on this one before we jump ahead? Okay.
So we
Serial
can't-
meeting. Yes.
So we can't comment as just a constituent, ever.
Member of the public.
You can if there's not a quorum of you there.
So in other words, we have to kind of do a head count
Oh, okay,
at the meeting to be sure there are not
Yes.
3 people, 3 commissioners there.
Yes.
got it.
There's somebody speaks in the back door.
So a serial meeting
Hustle them out.
is anytime where you're kind of piecing together a quorum to be discussing, deliberating, hearing an issue. So the serial meeting kind of gets to this question of what if somebody's watching? What if a third commissioner is watching this meeting where 2 commissioners have commented on a council item? That could become problematic if whatever was being discussed eventually comes before the commission, because then you've already had the deliberations of two members of the commission making a comment to the council about this issue in their capacity as constituent. You've had a third commissioner kind of consider what they've said, and then by the time we come back together and actually decide this issue before the commission, there's already potentially some consensus that is formed about whatever is before the commission. So it gets tricky when you make comments to the legislative bodies that eventually could come back and affect you. So serial meetings can happen in a number of different ways. And when I first got into this racket and heard these 2 different terms, the chain and the hub conspiracy, the hub and spoke conspiracy, I was a little bit giddy because it reminded me of one of the first days of criminal law, because this is the same terms used to describe criminal conspiracies. So in a chain serial meeting, you've got one commissioner talking to another, and then that commissioner taking whatever was discussed on to a third. And by then you've had 3 commissioners knowing what all of them think, and a consensus could form. A majority to take action could already be deliberating, discussing, before there's been any notice, before there's been any public comment, before there's been any deliberation with the remaining commissioners. The other is the hub and spoke serial meeting, where one commissioner speaks to another of you and then goes to a third and kind of starts to potentially form a consensus around an issue that way. And who knows, by the end, maybe one commissioner has talked to all 4 of you and got it all set, and the decision is practically made, and the decision when it comes to the formal meeting could just be ceremonial. And that's the fear. That's why this sort of serial meeting is prohibited under the Brown Act, is because even well-meaning people can very easily slip into this sort of behavior. And so that's why the Brown Act makes it explicit to prohibit that kind of communication, to prevent that from happening. And here in this age of technology, it's important to keep in mind that communications happen in an unlimited number of different ways: text messages, Skype, FaceTime, Facebook posts, private messages on Facebook. And any and all of that communication can result in a serial meeting happening. And really, the form of the communication doesn't matter. Even though the Brown Act doesn't explicitly call out Skype, the communication is very liberally construed under case law that has kind of probed this issue. So another issue that sometimes comes up, I don't know how often it comes up for the commission, is when can you participate remotely? If you're off at a conference and it's on a meeting night, but you'd like to still participate because there's something on the agenda that you've got a strong opinion on or really want to participate in the discussion on, then that might be okay. When you're participating remotely, it's important that wherever you're participating from also is a place that's accessible to the public. The public needs to be able to be heard from wherever you're participating from. So you can't just call in while you're rushing down the freeway, because it's going to be real hard for members of the public to flag you down, jump in the back seat, and participate.
Or in your hotel room.
In your hotel room. We've had clients who have asked, I'm going to be staying at this hotel, I plan on calling in. And at that point, the solution, if they really want to do that, is either go to the business center and work from there, because that's usually more public space at a hotel. Or alternatively, put a notice at the front of the hotel and another one on your hotel room door and prop that open while you're participating in the meeting. And it seems silly and funny, but it happens, and it happens maybe more often than you would think it would. The other thing is that a quorum has to meet within the jurisdiction. So you could never have a teleconference situation where 3 of you are calling in and only 2 of you are sitting here. That's just a requirement of the Brown Act, and that's to dissuade just kind of phoning in from wherever and not really having a place for the public to convene, and actually for the majority of the public, because in all likelihood, very few people are going to be wherever you are remotely and actively want to participate from there. So it's to maintain that place where the public can actually participate in a meaningful way. So notice of meetings needs to be done in a timely fashion. Regular meetings have to be noticed 72 hours in advance. They can be noticed further out, but the bare minimum is 72 hours before the meeting is to begin. Our meetings begin at 7 p.m., so calculate back 72 hours from then. What is that, Sunday at 7 p.m.? But we post them a little earlier because we don't expect staff to be here on Sunday nights posting agendas, and that would be a little much. So if you post it on Friday and you find a mistake and need to change it, it's okay to still swap that agenda out and put up a different agenda on Saturday or on Sunday. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I feel it fits in anyway. But as soon as you get to that 72-hour mark, your agenda is locked in. There's very narrow circumstances under which the agenda can be changed then. For special meetings, the notice period is 24 hours, because special meetings are really designed when something truly special comes up. Typically, the Brown Act contemplates business being conducted on regular meeting dates. And that's, again, to provide the public with as much notice and ability to participate, because the public becomes accustomed to when meetings happen, and that's why regular meeting dates have to be set. Emergency meetings are truly that. They are, in the case of emergency, only. And I was speaking with Jeff about this last week, and he said, I don't remember ever having actually an emergency meeting. Usually it's a special meeting, and I can only remember participating in one, and that's where a wildfire had burned down some pump stations for a water district. So there was a genuine and true emergency of how to bridge the gap, not only for providing water service, but also fire suppression reasons. So emergency is really that. So having a meeting without notice would be truly extraordinary, and I can't conceive of a situation where the Planning Commission would ever run into that, but you may participate in other public legislative bodies, so it may come up then. So the content of the notice required under the Brown Act is, first, you have to know that there is a meeting taking place, and the agenda kind of serves that purpose. If there's an agenda, then there must be business that's being conducted. First, or second, it has to be posted for the entire notice period, and that gets back to those 72 hours. You can't just slap the notice up on Sunday at 7 p.m., Monday morning, yank it down, and say, we had it up there 72 hours in advance. It has to actually be there the entire time. And depending on where notices happen, some people have gotten in trouble for that because, the wind blew it off the library window, and that's not good enough because the Brown Act requires that notice be posted the entire time. As I said earlier, you can't change the agenda in the middle of the notice period. You can't say, oh, I remembered one more thing. Can't come in like Columbo and add one more little item. Now there are limited exceptions to that. And that kind of goes back to the emergency meetings. It's where you're in that narrow set of circumstances where you've got a noticed meeting, you're meeting on a regular meeting or you've got a special meeting, and some emergency happens between when the agenda is posted and when you have your meeting. Under those circumstances, you can tack the emergency item onto that already posted agenda. But to do so, you need a 2/3 majority agreeing to do so, or the entire body if there's not at least 2/3 of you here, so 2/3 of 5. I'm not a math major, I'm not sure what that works out to. I think that would be 4. So if there's not 4 of you here, then everybody has to agree. And the urgency for this, much like with the emergency meetings themselves, is it really the need for action has to be so immediate that posting a 24-hour notice for a special meeting would be too late. The town would have burned down by then, whatever it is. And another key thing where I think most legislative bodies get into trouble is if they try to add something on an emergency basis, but they've already known about the issue well in advance, where there would have been an opportunity to put it on the agenda just in case an issue becomes more dire, and then maybe it gets more severe. But one of the requirements for adding an item like this under the emergency provision is that there cannot have been any knowledge of the issue prior to the agenda being posted. So if you knew about it, it's too late. Then you have to notice it as a special meeting or put it on your next regular meeting agenda. Then actually having the meetings. A big part of the Brown Act is the public comment, and that gets back to the public participation piece of it. As far as public comments for items not on the agenda, there is no explicit requirement in the Brown Act to allow public comment on that. But as good practice, most legislative bodies do. If it is allowed, then it's important to keep in mind that it's not okay for the legislative body to discuss those items, because everybody else in the public, while they may have an interest in the legislative body taking up that issue, they haven't been provided the proper notice that this was going to be discussed on that particular meeting. So what is appropriate at that point is to direct staff to either bring it back, to ask clarifying questions of the commenter, but to begin having deliberations and discussions about the item. That rises to a Brown Act violation, just because we've not had that proper notice for other members of the public to fully participate and provide their own comments. Another thing that it kind of changes a little bit from legislative body to legislative body is how commenters are welcome. Some legislative bodies have comment cards out there and require them militantly to be filled out. And that's actually a little bit over the top of what the Brown Act requires and allows. Commenters may fill out those cards and they may give their name, but there's no requirement that they do so. Somebody could walk up and give a public comment, so long as it's within the conduct rules of time limits, if there are any, and as long as it's on the right item or an item not on the agenda. But there's no need to identify yourself. There's no need for you to provide any other personally identifiable information. Why you're giving the comment, for instance. Sometimes members of the public might feel shy because they feel obligated to give a reason for their comment. But that's not required under the Brown Act. There's no justification requirement for making a comment. Likewise, there's no requirement that a member of the public give their address. And I've seen it where members of the public feel ashamed because they don't live in one part of town, but they really feel strongly about an issue that's in another part of town. And they felt like they had to rationalize that. So it's important to keep in mind there's no requirements for any personally identifiable information, personal information, to be given with a public comment. And that said, there is the latitude under the Brown Act to impose reasonable time limits on public comment. If you've got an issue before the legislative body and you've got a line of 64 people out the door, which is the most public commenters I've ever personally seen on an item, it's not reasonable to expect everybody, including the legislative body, to sit there and listen to the full length of time that anybody could conceivably take. So it's appropriate to impose reasonable limits on that. And what's reasonable is kind of dictated by the circumstance or the policies that have been adopted by the legislative body.
So you might impose a limit to each individual, in our case it's 3 minutes, but can you also impose a limit where public comment will only go for 2 hours?
You theoretically could, but it really gets tricky when you get to analyzing the reasonableness of that. For instance, if you've got 200 people that show up on an issue, there's no reasonable way for all of them to be heard within that 2 hours. That would give everybody a couple seconds. So under those circumstances, you may wish to continue the meeting for further public comment on a different night. And that, I've seen that happen as well, where the volume of public comment just gets to be so much that there's no way to meaningfully hear everybody.
So you really can't say, we're going to take as many as we can up to 2 hours and after that?
No, because that would disenfranchise everybody who's not squeezed in.
Okay.
So the reasonableness really is kind of limited to each individual. And 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, I've seen them all. 3 minutes is very standard. So for closed sessions, those rare occasions where it's okay for a legislative body to meet in closed session to discuss business and take action are really limited because, again, California's public policy is to have the public involved as much as possible. So typically it's labor and personnel issues, pending litigation, the exposure to litigation, real estate negotiations, but only for limited portions of that. And in all of the years of dealing with planning commission closed sessions are very rare. And I believe Loomis has had one in the last very many years. So it doesn't come up much, but it is possible. It's much more common for town council to have closed session meetings. And when having a closed session item, it's important to first give the public an opportunity to comment before you go into closed session. So the public must be given an opportunity to comment, and comments there would be based on what's on the agenda, because the reason for the closed session has to be laid out on the agenda. There's very specific language that's typically used, and it's laid out in the government code for what each ground for a closed session would have, and then public should be allowed to be heard, must be allowed to be heard on that. And then after the closed session, if an action was taken, it has to again be reported out from that closed session. So the procedural, kind of the strict procedure of that would be, you start out an open session, there is the announcement by the commission in your case, that a closed session meeting will take place, or a closed session item will be heard. The public is given an opportunity to comment. At that point, the closed session is convened. The public is excluded, as well as any staff that's not essential to discussing the particular closed session item at issue. Really, the closed sessions need to be minimized to essential personnel only. There's no way to just include as much staff as you'd like, as happens to be in the room, that is not within the meaning of closed sessions under the Brown Act. And then after the closed session discussion happens, if any action was taken, the commission again comes out of the closed session, reconvenes the open meeting, and reports out what action was taken. If there's no action taken, there's no need for that additional step.
But if you have report the action, doesn't that disclose the confidentiality of the meeting?
It discloses the action. The action is not confidential. It's the deliberations that went into that action that are allowed to be confidential under the Brown Act under very limited circumstances.
Okay.
And in the case of discussing pending litigation, there's no action taken on that. So that's a typical one where there is no action reported. An action that could conceivably come out of that is we've decided to retain some special counsel to represent us in this matter. And that would be an acceptable report out. We've directed staff to engage special counsel for this pending litigation. So, last but not least, Brown Act violations. How bad can it be? What can they do to us? It's not as serious as criminal conspiracies, but there are ramifications for violating the Brown Act. And kind of a first step is typically to be required to cure what you've done and to correct the action where it can be corrected. So the purpose of any cure and correct steps that you may take, because you can always basically self-report and fix an issue yourself as soon as you become aware that an issue has happened. An appropriate cure and correct step will mean that whatever violation happened can't happen again. And in the case of doing a good job of policing yourself that way, you might actually cut yourself off of litigation liability, as was the case in that Transparent Gov Novato v. City of Novato case earlier this year. The issue there had been that a comment had been made. One of the city council members in Novato had asked that staff be directed to further look into an issue. A majority of the council there declined to do so because it was an issue that had already been brought before the council. It had been decided. The majority of the council didn't want to revisit this past decision. But then a longer discussion of this issue ensued, and that issue hadn't been on the agenda. So they deliberated about an issue and the potential of whether or not to bring it back. And Transparent Gov Novato had sent a letter and said, hey, you've violated the Brown Act. We're going to sue you. And in the meantime, the city of Novato updated its council policies on how staff is to be directed to take future, or to bring future items before the council. In that case, the policy was amended that no oral requests could be made to add items to future agendas. All of that had to be in writing. So as soon as that opportunity to have such oral requests of staff was eliminated by this adopted city policy in Novato, there was no potential for this type of violation to happen again in the future. And so the case that was brought by Transparent Gov against the city, there was no result that could come out any better than what the city had already done to itself. They had already amended the policy, which was exactly what the court would have imposed anyway. So the case was dismissed, and there was no litigation liability remaining. Now, there's also the potential for civil and criminal penalties under the Brown Act. Admittedly, criminal penalties, I've not come across them, but theoretically it is possible. Civil penalties are much more likely. Monetary fines happen fairly regularly. But typically that kind of liability arises where there's been repeated violations by the same legislative body, or repeated violations by the same individual who may be a member of multiple legislative bodies, or somebody screwed up when they were on a board of directors for a special district. They've moved on to a council. They did the same thing again. At that point, there's much more of a risk of civil liability. And so, with that, are there any questions? And if not, you've got my contact information and can email me.
Nobody wants to say anything. I'm afraid.
So questions about this are fair game. This presentation was on the agenda.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have your contact information?
Yes, you should. And if not, I'll have
I'll forward it to all of you.
Alrighty. Okay, thank you very much.
Jeff is also fair game for questions. Forward them to me or answer them.
So, were you adding something, Brett, or you're just
Nope.
closing down? Okay. All right, then I guess we're done. The only other item is we moved one of the earlier issues to the end, which is commission reports for anything that's not on the agenda. Nope. Okay, see nothing there.
I want to thank Carol for making us the larger copy of the schedule. Thank you.
Yeah, good idea. Okay, meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Oh,
I do have a question.
to send to you if we notice inconsistencies. Okay, because I came across one the other day and I thought, it was something was, it was just